Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Fujinon XF 16-55mm F2.8 RLM-WR Mark II. My top video for 2024 was a comparison between the existing Fuji 16-55mm F2.8, then also the Fuji 18-55mm F2.8 to F4 OIS lens, and then the third was the third-party Sigma 18-50mm F2.8. I wanted to see how the venerable and about decade-old Fuji zooms held up, number one, on the new 40 megapixel standard of cameras like my XH2, and then also against a newer third-party challenger in the form of the Sigma. Now, neither one of these things existed back when these lenses were launched. The resolution standard was 16 megapixels at that point, and there were no third-party lenses on there. Now, the nearly 10-year-old zooms were not holding up very well, as what I found. And of course, Fuji was clearly aware of that, and they have replaced both of them. Both this lens we're looking at today, and then also the new 16-50mm that was a replacement for the existing 18-55mm. So I will be releasing, obviously, this review, and then a review of this lens, and then finally I will do a fresh comparison between these two and the Sigma to let you know how the newer lenses hold up against the newer third-party challenger. Now, for those that don't speak Fuji, I'll give you a quick breakdown of what all of those letters mean. The R in the name stands for aperture ring. LM stands for linear motor. WR stands for weather resistant. Now, all of those things were part of the original formula. They've just been improved and updated in this new lens we have here. Now, as far as prices go of the three main challengers at this point, the Sigma MSRP is $549. Right now, you can get it well under $500. The Fuji 16-50mm is as much, MSRP is $699. You can get it as little as $400 in kit. And of course, this is the premium option with the premium price. It is $1,199 US. So quite expensive, but as we're going to see, it's also pretty awesome. So let's dive in by taking a look at the build and handling. My first observation when I took the lens, I was unpacking the gear. Both of these lenses arrived at the same time. And when I was taking this out of the box, my first kind of double take was, particularly with the lens hood off, was, did I grab the right lens? Is this the new 16-50mm? And I confirmed the fact that it was the 16-55mm. It is a significantly smaller lens. According to Fuji, it has 38% less volume, and it is a full 37% lighter than the lens that it replaces. And I can tell you, just as far as holding the lens and visualizing it first, it is a whole different class of lens in terms of the size. So kudos to Fuji in being able to seriously downsize the lens. And it is just much, much improved in that regard. And so as far as the overall actual dimensions of the lens, it is 78.3 millimeters in diameter. That is 3.1 inches. It is 95 millimeters in length, or 3.7 inches. So it is a full 5 millimeters narrower in terms of the overall dimensions, exterior dimensions, and it is a whopping 9 millimeters shorter. And so that is a significant downsizing. As a part of that, the filter size has shrunk from 77 millimeters to 72 millimeters. And so that's either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on whether or not you're already invested in 77 millimeter filter threads. But the good news is you can always use a step-up ring to 77 millimeter filter threads, or filters, I should say, if you so desire. Hugely different is the weight. The weight is 410 grams now, or 14.5 ounces. That is a whopping 245 grams less than the lens that it replaces. So now the difference between this lens and the Sigma having a much smaller both zoom range, 18 to 50 millimeters as opposed to 16 to 55 millimeters. It also has fewer features and less thorough weather sealing, all of those things. But now the difference is only 135 grams, which is still, significant, but it's not massive anymore. Before, there was 370 grams between the two lenses, which means that the gap between those two existing lenses was actually more than what the Sigma itself weighs. And so to have shrunk that gap so much is a huge step on Fuji's part. I also was pleased to see, I've kind of been commenting for many years at this point, that the formula for features on Fuji's lenses basically doesn't change, at least in this style of lens. You have the aperture ring, and that's basically it as far as features. That's still kind of true here, but what has changed is this is the first of their lenses to have an ability to declick the aperture. And so now you have an option, which is great considering how much Fuji's bodies now also feature video-centric features. You now have the ability to do aperture racking with the lens and to smoothly go through the range of the aperture. You have as before, you do have an aperture lock here that if you're depressing it will allow you to go into the auto mode, but then the ring won't move if you're in auto mode, or if you click it again and you get into just the standard manual aperture range, you won't be able to just slip into the automatic mode without declicking that. And so, that's about it as far as features, but certainly both of those things are welcome in terms of the design. Also welcome is the fact that they have updated the total number of aperture blades from 9 to 11. Having more blades tends to be associated with a little bit more premium, and it allows you to have a more circular shape. And whether or not it's entirely necessary, I don't necessarily know. But what I will say is that that is certainly an admission that this is a premium lens, and so a higher number of aperture blades, say, compared to the 16 to 50 millimeter, which has 9 blades. It's just a step towards a more premium build. And so again, I'm just glad to see there being a little bit of wiggle room in Fuji's design to move things a little more upscale. The lens is thoroughly weather sealed, and so that starts with a gasket here at the lens mount. There are internal seals, fluorine coating on the front element, a very nice degree of weather sealing. Now, there are a couple of negatives I do need to point to. The first of those is that in the zoom action, it isn't the smoothest zoom range. And there are a few sticking points in the copy that I'm testing. And so I was a little curious, well, maybe it's just copy specific. But I noted in some of the user reviews, for example, on B&H Photo, that there were some people that pointed to the same thing. And so at the very least, in this early crop of these, that does seem to be a potential problem. So you can see here that as I'm trying to zoom in and out to demonstrate the zoom range, from 16 to 55 millimeters, you'll see it's not an entirely smooth process. And that's because there's a certain amount of weight that gets you about 3/4 of the way through the zoom range, gets me to about 40, 42 millimeters. And then there's a little bit of a sticking point and a different kind of resistance, a little heavier resistance to get that last bit to 55 millimeters. Not great in a premium priced zoom like that. And of course, it's made worse by the fact that the 16 to 50 is an internally zooming lens, and it actually zooms really, really nicely. And so I hate to see the more expensive lens be the poorer lens in that performance. It is what it is. The other thing that I wouldn't say is amazing is actually the feel of the manual focus ring. It is definitely, the damping is a little on the light side in my opinion. I actually prefer the feel of the ring on the 16 to 50 millimeter. Don't worry, there's lots that I like less about the 16 to 50, but in these two things, both the zoom action and the manual focus action, I do prefer the 16 to 50 millimeter over this lens. One thing I will say about Fuji lenses, when you manual focus, it isn't like a nice linear movement back and forth like a true manual focus lens. Definitely, particularly if you're trying to move with some precision, slower, you really see kind of visible steps. It's like chunks of focus rather than a linear process. I would like to see them improve that. What is improved here, however, is that, kind of interestingly, even though the previous lens and this lens both say that the minimum focus distance is 30 centimeters, for some reason the magnification is significantly improved on this lens. It is now a 0.21 times level of magnification. I believe the older lens was around 0.15 times. And so that's a really nice improvement, and glad to see that. So the build quality is nice here, just a couple of little negatives there. So let's talk about autofocus for stills. Now, this lens, like its predecessor, has a linear motor, but this is a newer technology compared to the other lens. And the other comparison, when I did all three lenses head-to-head, the Sigma with its STM motor actually had a better autofocus performance than either of the two Fuji lenses. That's no longer the case. And in fact, in a comparison between the three lenses, now the Sigma has moved to where really it should be, which is at the bottom of the heap of the three, with this lens as it should be on the top. It has the most overall thrust in terms of the focus speed. It's nice and quiet in operation, and it is smooth. It's, in fact, I would say probably the best focusing Fuji zoom that I have used to this point. I mean, a lens like the 200mm F2 is really amazing, has great focus motors, but this lens is really pretty much top of the heap. This lens actually does a pretty decent job of keeping up with action. I found that in taking pictures of moving children moving around, that it was just able to give me better focus results than what I'm accustomed to seeing on Fuji platforms. And I found that the overall accuracy was good in all the different applications I used it. It's quiet and it's fast. Now, Fuji's camera autofocus is still a little clunky relative to the competitors. It is my least favorite of the four platforms that I regularly test. But what I can tell is using that baseline, not using a Sony baseline or a Canon baseline, but using a Fuji baseline, this is definitely a great focusing lens, which gives me hope that as the autofocus improves in the future in the camera bodies, this lens is going to really shine on future cameras. It is clearly at this point better than the Sigma, and I think that that is the very base minimum of what they needed to accomplish. I believe that they have done that. Now, when it comes to the video side of things, for video autofocus, the bad is the typical Fuji frustrations. And again, it's not really the lens's fault, but for example, when I'm wanting to move from one focus point to another by hitting the touchscreen can be a little bit reluctant to make focus. So you hit a spot and sometimes there's a lag before the lens actually starts focusing. I do still see on video focus pools, I still see even in this very good focusing lens, I see the little micro adjustments. And so it gets 98% of the way there, and then it has to fiddle around with that last 2%. It doesn't just go confidently in a linear fashion from focus point A to focus point B without any kind of drama. There's always got to be those little bit of micro adjustments, which frankly can, particularly when you're aware of them, they can just be a little bit annoying. But on the good side of things, the video focus pools are much better than what I typically see. There are no visible steps along the way, and so it is a good smooth process, at least to that 98% degree. Focus breathing is low with this lens. I found, which I haven't found always to be the case in the past, I found that I could shoot kind of a talking head segment like what I'm doing right now, and I could get stable results. As you can see here, I'm going to have audio off, but you can see the footage that during this time, autofocus is engaged, but it's not doing that little bit of micro pulsing or hunting around or slipping focus, but rather it's staying locked on as it should. Likewise, when I shot on my XH2, I found that it did a pretty good job of tracking me as I moved towards the camera. If I stepped in and out of the frame, it picked me up relatively quickly. Not as fast as what I see on other platforms, but it did good for Fuji. That's on the XH2, however. When I did the same kind of test on the XM5, which I happened to be testing at the same time, on the XM5, it failed it miserably. And as you can see, focus just quit moving ahead at some point. And so I say that to say, still, even with this good focusing lens, your mileage is going to vary based on what camera body that you're using. Even if you're using a fairly recent one, it's Fuji. I did find that my hand test went pretty good, and so the transition from the hand to my eye and back and forth, it's not flawless, but it did a pretty good job overall. Again, it is better than what I typically see. So I will say this, my conclusion on autofocus is that autofocus in the lens seems to be excellent. It is making the most of what is a limited autofocus system. And so good news for the lens, and hopefully good news to come in the future for the camera bodies. So let's talk about the overall image quality, and I'm going to give you an overview here, and then we will do a deep dive after that. I'll give you the broad strokes. The broad strokes is this. This is now easily the best standard zoom on the platform and maybe the best APS-C standard zoom out there. This delivers really beautiful images, and finally, it feels like it's fully capable of keeping up with the 40 megapixel sensor. The optical design is 16 elements in 11 groups. That includes 4 aspherical elements, 3 extra low dispersion elements, and 1 super extra low dispersion element. The MTF, if you're looking at the low resolution standard, it's pretty much flawless, either on the wide or the telephoto M. When you jump to the higher standard, and to Fuji's credit, they do show a 45 lines pair, which is higher than what the typical 30 that we see from a lot of other lens makers. And so at least you're seeing something that is somewhat akin to an actual 40 megapixel sensor. And what I found is that obviously there's more variance in that MTF curve, and you're going to see softer corners towards the edges on a higher resolution body, but overall it still is going to show strong there. Now, when I was shooting some of the head-to-head comparisons for the upcoming video, in which I'm going to put all 3 of these lenses kind of head-to-head in a variety of tests, what I did find is that the 16 to 55 millimeter dominated in most categories, as it should. It has much lower fringing than the Sigma, for example. As you can see here, it's almost entirely neutral when it comes to fringing, but the Sigma shows a lot of fringing. It has much better contrast than the 16 to 50 millimeter, as you can see in this comparison here. It's not all roses, however. When it comes to the distortion is about the same as what I saw on the previous lens. And so on the wide end, there's a lot of barrel distortion. I needed a full plus 22 to correct for it. That's about the same as what we saw before. And then on the telephoto end, there's a fair bit of pincushion distortion requiring a minus 13 to correct for it there. Again, both of those metrics are within the range of what the previous lens was. But what has gotten a lot worse in the downsizing of the lens is that vignette is much higher. On the previous lens, on the wide end, I needed about a plus 48 to correct for the vignette. I now need a full plus 91, almost maxing out the slider to correct on the wide end. And on the telephoto end, I need a plus 84. And so there is a lot of vignette that is present. And again, I think that that's probably what gave in the whole journey to try to downsize the lens. As noted already, however, it has excellent control of fringing, and that's true whether you're talking about the longitudinal style before and after the plane of focus or the lateral style that's in the corners. In both of those metrics, it performs very, very well. When it comes to sharpness and contrast at 16 millimeters, I found that even at f2.8 that it is pretty consistently good across the frame. The corners obviously look weaker than what the center or the mid frame do, but when I went and compared it to the other competing lenses, I found that it had the best corners of the 3 different lenses. So, I mean, it's still better there, which it should be. I also found that there was more improvement to be had at f4. And so you'll see more contrast and more detail all across the frame, stopping down to f4. After f4, things basically stay pretty much the same. From f4 to f8, results are, the differences are so minuscule that I couldn't hardly spot them even at 200% magnification. You go beyond that, and at f11, you're going to see a bit of softening due to diffraction. Minimum aperture here is actually f22, and so you will see that diffraction becomes very obvious by f22, much softer. As I moved on through the zoom range, I found that at 23 millimeters, everything is improved at f2.8. It's better in the center, it's better in the mid frame, obviously better in the corners. I would say actually that somewhere in there is close to peak performance. It is outstanding at 23 millimeters, and for a standard zoom, it's delivering a great result. I found that 35 millimeter looks good as well, with some give and take with 23 millimeters depending on where you look at it. I would say overall I would consider 23 millimeters to be better, but 35 millimeters is still very good. So in the middle of that zoom range, it is doing a fantastic job. 55 millimeters is really, really good in the center. I would say that it's actually better in the center than what I saw at 35 millimeters. But the corners look a little bit weaker. And so taking as a whole, I would say it's a little bit softer, but very importantly, the center of the frame, and I would say even into the rule of thirds, looks really, really good. And so as a byproduct, I found that real world images actually look really good at 55 millimeters with good detail, good contrast, again, even when shooting at 40 megapixels. Overall, I would say also the bokeh is mostly good. The truth of the matter is that I have probably yet to see a standard zoom where I consider the bokeh to be just like amazingly good. It's often not where these lenses particularly thrive, but I would say that this one is better than most. The geometry is pretty good towards the edges of the frame. I do see in specular highlights, bokeh balls, that there's a little more inner lining that I would like. And so I do see in some situations where there's stuff in the transition zone, it's a little busier than what I would like, but overall the bokeh quality is good. Colors are great, and that's something I think that Fuji does fantastic with. I always find that their optical glass produces really nice looking color, and so that's definitely true here. And I also found the flare resistance to be quite good. And whether it was kind of incidental light coming through a window or shooting right towards the sun, flare resistance overall is really, really good. In general, I would say that the optical performance is great outside of, some fairly strong vignette and distortion. And I would say the vignette is the only area where it's regressed relative to the first generation lens. But in every other metric, it is vastly improved. I found in basically that images look pretty prime-like coming off of it, and that's about as good as what you're going to get from a standard zoom. So my conclusion is this: the Fuji 16-55mm F2.8 Mark II is exactly what it should be. It is the premium option at the premium price, and it has been improved over the first generation lens in almost every way. And I will say this, not only do I really like the lens, but in a trend that I've been seeing with some of these newer releases from Fuji, particularly those that are, some of the more premium lenses, it gives me more hope about the 40 megapixel sensor. Early on, it seemed like almost everything I put on the camera just looked bad relative to what I expected. But as lenses are being developed with this sensor in mind, the performance is getting better, and my feeling about the sensor is getting more positive as we move along. The bad news is that if you move to the 40 megapixel sensor, there's a good chance that a lot of your older lenses, you're not going to love the way that they look on this. But if you're willing to upgrade to the newer glass, I think Fuji's doing a good job of developing lenses that are designed with this sensor in mind and are able to actually resolve it and produce the kind of results that I would expect. If you want more information, you can check out my text review that's linked in the description down below. You can check out the image gallery that's also linked there. There are buying links if you would like to take a look at that. Now, if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now, and we're going to jump into that together. All right, let's start by taking a look at distortion and vignette here. And so you can see there is a significant amount of barrel distortion. If there's anything positive, you can see here that it does correct in a pretty linear fashion. It's a plus 22 to correct for it. You can see, however, vignette is really heavy. And even at a plus 92, I could probably crank it even further. There's still a little bit of a hint of discoloration in those corners. So obviously the vignette is not great. Telephoto end of things, you can see a significant amount of pincushion distortion, a minus 13 to correct. Once again, however, it does correct in a good linear fashion. Vignette is still heavy, though you can see a little less heavy, about a plus 84 to correct to this point, and those corners are looking good. Anything but this completely uniform background, and you wouldn't see anything there. So the vignette is probably the most disappointing part of the optical design. Otherwise, things are pretty good here. Here's a look at what is covered in this particular zoom range. And so you can see you've got a nice wide framing and the ability to go into a much tighter telephoto framing. And so obviously there's going to be a lot of various subjects that are going to fall within that range. Really great control here of fringing, and so you can see this is one of the torture tests that I do because it will really show off fringing. In fact, in the Sigma example, you can see lots of fringing. You can see just a tiniest little bit here and there. It's nothing significant. This shot here, because I'm intentionally creating a depth of field, and so I have before and after the plane of focus. Both of these shiny areas, there's just the tiniest amount of fringing, nothing that's ever going to be an issue at all. It is definitely the best of the available standard zoom lenses on Fuji in this aspect. On the chart test, you can see again, it shows the same kinds of things, that there's just minimal amounts of fringing, nothing significant there. And if we look towards the edge of the frame for the lateral style, chromatic aberrations, no corrections are on here. You can see it looks really nice and clean. No problem there either. So when it comes to resolution and contrast, we're going to look at results at 200% magnification. This is, of course, a 40 megapixel sensor. Center of the frame looks great. Good detail, good contrast, and no concerns there. You can see even looking down at these stamps, there's good detail there. If I look at the mid-frame looks really quite good. Very good detail everywhere that I look. And then if we move on down here, pretty consistent performance from here to here. If anything, actually, I would say there's a little more contrast there. This probably falls in one of those dips we saw in the MTF chart. And looking on down towards the very corner, we can see that it looks pretty good, and it's a little softer in the extreme corner, but really not bad. If we pop up to the opposing corner, we can see that the centering is good and detail is also good there. Stopping down to f4 definitely does improve contrast. You can see that the shadow areas looks a little bit more intense. So the difference between the shadow and the bright areas is definitely stepped up. Looking up here, I think you can see the difference here pretty well. You can see in the hair, for example, here it's it's almost like gray levels of the blacks, but here they're much darker, and thus like here in this one, you can see the difference between the dark and the light is much better than at f2.8. Now from f4 to f5.6, again, I don't really see much of a difference. I don't see really any further difference from f5.6 to f8 either. Now from f8 to f11, you'll start to see a little bit of softening due to diffraction. It still looks pretty good here. You'll find a huge difference, however, when you move past f11, particularly by the time you get to f22, it looks really soft due to the effects of diffraction. When we move on to 23 millimeters, you can see uniform excellence here. Center of the frame looks really, really good, even a bit better than what we saw at 16 millimeters. Mid-frame looks fantastic. It looks more like the f4 result at 16 millimeters. And in all of these different places where I look on this, it's holding up really well, right down into the corners, which definitely have more contrast and pop than what we saw before. Left side also looking good. Good detail and contrast there. 35 millimeters also looks good in the center, and then if I look in the mid frame here, it looks a little less good in this zone than what it did at 23 millimeters. It actually looks quite good on this side, down into this zone, and even into here, all looking quite good. And so there is some give and take. Overall, however, this is still really in the excellent range of performance. To take a look at this shot and kind of a real world in this range right here, this is f2.8. You can see even if I've had to bring up the shadows here a little bit because it was backlit, but you can see just how good the detail and rendering all the fine hairs, all of that is really, really strong, much better than what I'm accustomed to seeing off of any of these standard zooms on this 40 megapixel sensor. Now at 55 millimeters into the telephoto range, center of the frame looks excellent, as you can see. You can see here, for example, it's not quite as crisp, and in these mid-frame zones, it doesn't look as good, and up here into the corners, you can see it's a little bit softer than what we have seen. I'll just pan around to some of the other spots, and so you can take a look at them. So not as strong as what we have seen elsewhere, but of course, towards the middle of the frame where a lot of shots are going to be composed, and in this zone right here, looking pretty good. If you do want a little bit more contrast pop at 55 millimeters, stopping down to f4 once again does definitely make a difference there, and you can see in the mid-frame a pretty significant improvement in contrast and detail. Corners are better, not as exceptionally good as what we saw elsewhere. Stopping on down to f5.6 improves things further, as you can see in the corners. And so again, if you want to have sharp resolution all across the frame, stop on down to f5.6 at 55 millimeters and you'll get there. So here you can see 55 millimeters f2.8, and kind of in a real world shot, even though we're pretty close to the top of the frame, you can see that there is plenty of detail in the skin tones and all of that. You can see also the colors look really rich. I really like that aspect. Here's also 55 millimeters in f2.8, and again, focus is nailed on the actual eyeball, not somewhere around the eye, but it's focused where it should be, in detail and contrast looks really good. This shot, I think, illustrates the really great color that Fuji's optical glass provides. I really like the look of the image itself. And here, when it comes to the minimum focus distance, obviously magnification level is definitely much, much better. Also, detail is pretty good up close, and so I have no real complaints about that. Here's another shot near minimum focus, and you can see the depth of field will be quite small, but you can see where it's focused on these little etched keys. Looks nice and sharp there. You can see a look at the overall specular highlight shape. This is f2.8, and yeah, you're going to get some deformation in the corners, but as I looked at the other lenses, it actually looks better. My only real complaint here is that outlining there, which is going to show up in a little bit of busyness in some shots. Now this shot, because there's a good ratio between the subject, distance to the subject, and then the distance to the background, bokeh looks great, really soft. You can see specular highlights are nice and round and creamy looking. Detail looks great, no problem there. In this shot, again, because the background is really defocused, it looks great. Ice crystals really nicely defined there, looks awesome. In this image here, however, you can see it just looks a little bit busier, and that's because the ratio isn't as favorable. So that's where that outlining, I think, is going to come into play a little bit. But again, for a standard zoom, bokeh looks pretty great. And finally, flare resistance. Here, you can't really tell because there's really bright sun coming through that window and lots of shiny objects. I don't really see ghosting artifacts. Contrast is holding up pretty well. This shot here, again, bright, intense sun. You can see a little bit of the sunburst, sunstar effect you're going to get off the lens. But again, tiny little ghosting artifact here. This is f11, not much to see. Now, in this kind of shot, this is also at f11. You see a little bit more of the kind of prismatic effect. And as we've already seen, that's going to be a little bit more rare in normal shots. There's more affecting it when it comes through glass like this. And so at the end of the day, I'm not too vexed by that. It still looks pretty good. So in general, a pretty strong optical performance. And so as you can see after the optical deep dive, this is a lens that really is performing at a nice high level. And hopefully the optical deep dive has helped you to make a more informed decision as to whether or not it's a lens that you're going to be adding to your own Fuji kit. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.